Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
Put it this way, say you've got a situation of a young woman who feels lost on campus. She can't seem to make friendships. She links up with this fellow. She enters into a sexual relationship very quickly, and before long they're living together. That could be a shield from the whole business of learning to relate to a large number of people, or of learning to cope with a complex, changing, pluralistic college environment.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Dr. Norman Gadan, director of the Counseling Center of the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik and Dr. Gadan will be discussing the morality of living together. Now, here's Father Bacik.
Norm, I always enjoy talking to you. You have a fertile mind, and you make a lot of good connections, and you know a lot of the research and data on the whole area of psychology and relationships and so on. And I really, for that reason, I
feel the same way about you, Jim, and I'm delighted to be here today.
You have come on this program to talk to me about that, and I wish you wouldn't be writing me notes while I'm introducing you and trying to get started, because you're throwing me off the track. And this is a serious program. It is not comedy hour, and you don't need to cut into my opening remarks as you've just done with that note that you've shown me. But I am serious, and I do appreciate you being on the program, and I do enjoy talking with you. And I would do it even if you hadn't paid me to make those comments.
Okay, now we got to get serious.
It's serious. I do have a serious topic I want to raise, and that is talking about college life in general, the search for intimacy among college students, the whole erotic, genital, sexual area, and especially the specific problem of living together. Now, my sense of this is that it is happening more, but probably not as much as people think. Now, I don't know the statistics. Maybe you have more data at hand, but clearly the incidence of of college students living together, young people generally living together who are not married, is growing.
Yes.
It happens.
I'm going to disappoint you because I don't know very many relevant statistics either about our local university or in general. It just seems to be increasing. It's become more acceptable, I think, in society's eyes.
There's a clear change in the thought about it. I mean, people just simply didn't do it before. If they did, they didn't talk about it. Now it does happen more often, and people talk openly about it, and it becomes a real challenge to the general prevailing norms that we have traditionally accepted in our society. It seems I see students doing this for a number of reasons. You know, I think of one particular case where a young woman, a young man did move in together, and I knew there was no sexual component to it, because they each had a girlfriend and a boyfriend, and who allowed it or were willing to go along with it. And
this is hard, of course, for many parents to believe. In fact, for many adults, just to believe that this could be true. But I've seen the same thing myself.
Yeah, and where I have believed the story and had every reason to believe it, I think we're often sort of leery about platonic relationships, and I think properly so. I mean, the sexual drive is real, and given enough time, it's easy for platonic relationships to move into genital sexual relationships. However, we do know cases where, by every appearance, that is what happens, and it's done, frankly, for convenience. In some cases,
economic reasons, sharing cooking, sharing expenses, that kind of thing.
For sure, yeah, it does happen. And I think also, sometimes I think it happens in more group settings where you'll have a couple guys and a couple women living in the house together, and sometimes I believe it's done for the sake of inculcating friendships or getting to know one another. In fact, I knew one young man who did enter into such a relationship because he had no experience with women. He didn't have any sisters, and he really felt he needed to do that. Now, he did it for that very reason, to move into a setting where he could begin to relate and understand how women operated and so on. And his report to me was that indeed it was beneficial to him, that he knew a lot more after a year's time.
He'd get out of that experience much what he might get out of living together in a dormitory that was combined with, where men and women were combined, where they could talk after dinner, eat meals together, share experiences. And it was actually a learning experience for him, and a growing experience as opposed to anything necessarily sexual. Then, of course, there are examples where it is sexual. A young couple, unmarried, live together, or several couples live together in a kind of communal house, or people maintain separate apartments, or one lives in a dormitory, one lives in an apartment, and they're together as if they were living together, a kind of pseudo-living together. Infinite varieties of it.
Yeah, great varieties. And I think that one of the things is that we'd have to begin to look into this matter in greater depth and to see what's going on. Now, I see a lot of problems with it. And I'd sort of like to raise some of those problems.
Please do.
And then maybe we can talk those through. One is, and I believe the research shows this, that it very often people do not think about it ahead of time very much. That there's a whole lot of incidents where it just sort of happens. In other words, they fall into it without considering ramifications, without thinking of the consequences for themselves and others. And I believe that it has such significance in terms of personal development and in terms of the social consequences, in terms of parental disapproval, in terms of moral norms and so on, that one ought to think more carefully about it. I mean, it's not just like deciding to have lunch together.
Exactly.
It is much deeper than that. And I think we really have to look at that.
Could probably easily extend your critique here to marriage, to young people kind of rushing impulsively into marriage, and how many do you know who marry under the same circumstances? But I think you're absolutely right. Many people just, especially young people trying this for the first time, just kind of slide into it, find an apartment together, a room together, move into a house where there are a lot of young unmarried couples living, and just say, hey, this would be fun, this would be neat. It's just kind of a feeling or a sensation or an impulse. They really don't think it through very clearly. And I'm not sure that we've always provided them with sufficient vehicles to really think through this kind of a moral or ethical or values decision. Because you could look at it as an instance, really, a very key instance of a sort of decision that someone's faced with, and where would they have learned how to evaluate and judge, perhaps inadvertently at home, but I think most parents aren't sitting around teaching their kids, here's how you would think through living with somebody versus living alone.
Yeah, we've not had a lot of good open discussion about the thing, and it is a flag for sure, and a difficult one to deal with, and it is threatening to many people, and one would have to understand that. You know, one thing I think is that when students come to college, very often it is a threatening situation. Very often they're dealing with loneliness, and this move could be detrimental to their growth, their personal growth. Put it this way, say you've got a situation of a young woman who feels lost on campus. She can't seem to make friendships. She links up with this fellow. She enters into a sexual relationship very quickly, and before long they're living together. That could be a shield from the whole business of learning to relate to a large number of people, or of learning to cope with a complex, changing, pluralistic college environment. And that he just becomes for her a refuge from the rest of the developmental process she's supposed to be going through.
Things like that make it so hard to generalize about this, because I think that's entirely possible. Somebody jumps into especially early in college, jumps into a relationship. It evolves into living together very quickly. A full-blown sexual relationship is part of it, and there's a kind of an escape or avoidance of some of the mourning of leaving home, of some of the struggles of meeting new people, of some of the disappointments of going through the dating process, and yet on the other hand, Not all instances of living together are going to be that, and it's why it's so hard for me to generalize very far about it without knowing the young people involved and knowing the circumstance. There are times, I'm sure, where the students involved feel it's worked rather well. They've dated in the past, they've thought it through, they've evaluated it. For important reasons, they're not ready to marry, yet this kind of a pseudo-marriage they feel is a kind of preparation and a good beginning for what's to come later.
I think there's no doubt those of us who work with college students hear positive reports about the experience in addition to the negative ones.
Right.
You just can't get around that, can you?
I can't in my.
I mean,
own mind.
The students do report that.
They certainly do.
Some say
they
that
report
it has
plenty
been,
of the negative too, and
yeah.
you see any number of people who get in way over their heads, which I think is what you're talking about, way too quickly. It sours them possibly on close relationships. It may sour them on sex. It may sour them, unfortunately, on marriage. And they're left, having had a wild fling for 6 months, and it takes them 5 years maybe to unravel it all and to make sense of it.
Those are the sad cases that we get, right.
For them to see that, maybe they were trying to avoid a certain kind of intimacy and maybe rebel at the same moment.
That's right. Rebel. I mean, a couple of things in there that you said I want to pick up on.
We've left out really the entire ethical,
so
moral dimension here.
so much that we have to get into yet. I think we're sort of attacking this in terms of the problems that one sees, and of course the moral, ethical thing stands behind all of that and is a pervasive question. The problem is, how do we adjudicate the
how do we? I mean, I think if anybody would know how to bring that dimension into it, it would be you.
I think always we get back in the moral realm to the question of persons and the valuing of the dignity and worth of individuals has to be brought in. I mean, if I need to talk to a secular audience about values and morality, that seems to me to be rock bottom. That is, the question of persons being hurt. And therefore, when you look at this kind of situation, there's no doubt, I mean, the predominance of my own counseling experience is that people end up getting hurt. They get hurt, for example, a common thing is one person is in the living together relationship, it means commitment. And it's very often the woman, let's face it, because the sexual side of it means she's given herself. Women always talk, or the usual phrase is, I gave myself. Not that we had sex, or we have sex, but I gave myself. And it often represents a commitment, and very often I think for the young men involved, it doesn't represent that. I mean, unfortunately, sometimes it means it's somebody who will cook.
It's unequal.
Yeah, someone who will cook and do the laundry, and the young woman involved is just getting her dependent kind of feelings taken care of here in a way. She's found someone to watch over her, and or she doesn't feel lost and alone. And especially we see that at the time of breakups then. So I'm exemplifying my major point. When you ask me moral, ethical things, I mean, I can answer it in two ways. One is to look for what we used to call the natural law sense of it, or what I would call today the common sense reasonableness, which is based on the dignity and worth of persons. We simply are not allowed to hurt people, and we can't set up situations where people do end up getting hurt. We have to try to help people think through that so it doesn't happen. So some guy who wants a woman to move in with him and thinking, well, we both like it, we both put up with it, and we have our sexual relationship, and she cooks, and so on, what's the harm? The problem is that he's not thinking deep enough about it, or extensively enough. He's not realizing that maybe she's committed in a way that he isn't, that she can't separate sex from commitment. And therefore, she, somewhere along the line, is going to be hurt. He can't realize maybe that he's hurting himself by allowing himself to be cared for in this way, or living without commitment. Maybe he's postponing commitment because he can't afford to make it, or doesn't know how to make it, or psychically can't get around to it. So that's where I would say. Now, the second way I would answer it, I mean, is out of the Judeo-Christian framework, which talks to us about the sacredness of sex and the sexuality making most sense within a permanent, stable relationship that we call marriage, where there's trust and people can gradually work out their sexual adjustment, where failures in that regard won't be seen as the end of the world. where we'll end up with less impotency and frigidity because of the caring relationship that's established. So you can answer the question also out of the Judeo-Christian framework, which is a traditional wisdom that says full sexual activity, active intercourse that's implied in living together, makes sense within marriage.
Mm-hmm.
But I think for a secular audience, or for generally, it becomes the way that the problems involved lead to the hurt of persons. That's the strong argument. I mean, if I'm dealing with someone who's trying to sort it out, I'm going to say, look at the problem areas. I mean, I can tell them the Judeo-Christian tradition says no, but that isn't a persuasive, strong argument. What is needed is an attempt to look at these problem areas, which is the reason I wanted to approach it in that way.
So have you seen any of the instances, and probably not, where where living together has been a precursor to a successful marriage or to successful parenthood? Or
I mean, I think that's the point. I think I have. I think I have. I mean, at least I know married couples now who seem to be doing well, who did live together. Mm-hmm. I see a progression in this thing. I think even for them, marriage very often is not the commitment we think of. It is not permanent, lifelong. It's part of a continuum. I think that very often they make their real commitments maybe when they have their first child, or when it comes to the religious upbringing of their child and so on, that they think, geez, this really is permanent. I mean, I see it as a continuum here, and the living together seems to fit into that framework. So I don't think you can argue it on the grounds of saying absolutely every time it leads to these horrible results. I mean, that's not fair. Mm-hmm. It's not honest. It's not intellectually honest, because you and I have seen cases where it works differently.
As I hear you speak of this, it's all I can do to juggle in my own mind the very complex ways you have of expressing yourself and bringing in a secular and a religious philosophical mm-hmm. tradition. And I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of somebody who's 17 or 18, has a girlfriend, thinking about living together. And to me, it's very much like issues involving drug use or contraception or any of the more difficult, complicated moral decisions that we have to make. Young people who live together, and this maybe sounds condescending, I don't mean it that way, often are just not equipped yet to think of it and conceive of these issues in all their complexity. And hence, they almost by definition are trying things out sometimes too soon, too impulsively, too defensively, and there's almost a built-in self-defeating factor in it, mainly because of youth and inexperience.
I agree, but isn't when part of the job of the counselor, or if you put it in terms of people coming to me, what I want to do is to help them to think critically of this and to expose to them the potential problems which they may well not think of. I have to ask them, what do you think of commitment? What's this going to do to your ability to make a commitment? How does that factor into all this? Have you thought of what it means to the other person? Mm-hmm. How's it going to be for your own personal growth and development? What are you going to do when it breaks up? The odds are very high that you're going to split. How are you going to handle that at the time? Is this going to scar you? And I think a really important factor is, what about the parents? I mean, students have to make their own decisions. They have to go off on their own, but you don't do it in a vacuum. They come out of a family tradition. They very often come out of a religious tradition, especially the ones I talk to. What kind of conflict is this going to create within themselves? Moral conflict. I mean, I know a lot of people who are doing that who are feeling guilty.
Right.
And they act
or feel a certain kind of stress about it, even if they don't feel conscience-stricken or guilt in a
There's
deep
a deeper
sense.
anxiety
Kind
and stress, and very often it comes out in the way they deal with other people. Mm-hmm. They must think of what the parental generation thinks. As a moral theologian tries to point out to people all of the factors that we would normally miss. in a situation like that, and keep morality from just being do your own thing or does it feel right to you. It's not a sufficient criterion. You have to bring in, as I say, it seems important to me, consider parental feelings about it. Because we're not in a vacuum, and maybe some people should put it off. They're going to get married in a year, and there's questions, should they move in with each other now? I've advised you, well, wait, why put your parents through that, right now? They can't handle that. Why do that? Why don't you just stick it out, and the time will come to be married? So, I mean, that's the kind of thing.
How do the students react that you've counseled
well,
in
I've
this way?
seen some people who have decided not to on that very grounds. Now, of course, many people just go ahead and do it, as we know, and if there's a strong erotic side to this thing and people think they're in love, then I believe it becomes much harder because they are really, the love blinds them to this other thing. Then I think it becomes, when it's just convenience, or something, it doesn't, or even if it's just sexual experimentation, it looks different to them. But when the love is there as a component, then I believe that it becomes harder for them to accept more critical judgment on it. Norm, what do you think yourself when you end up talking to people like that? What are your senses of the motivation that you see, and of what's going on beneath the surface? Now, you mentioned rebellion before, and I think it's a factor. You want to expand on that?
I think it is a factor, too, and I don't think it's always a factor, and I think it sometimes even changes within the same relationship. I think it's more likely to be a factor at the beginning when the decision is made than possibly later on, especially if the relationship of living together works out. But a number of students we've worked with in the counseling center who've chosen to go this route talk a great deal about how they know it's going to affect their families, and they're not unhappy that it's going to bother mom and dad. And they say things like, well, they'll just have to live with it. Times are changing. They've got to get with it. It's a new world now. And you get the sense that it's one way they have of kind of sticking it to them without necessarily directly and openly going up to them and saying, I'm going to rebel. It's a very, in a way, indirect but very overt way of saying some important things to parents, and
don't you get
therefore
that,
makes it hard, I would think, hard for a student to trust that the relationship is built out of love and responsibility and commitment, knowing that somewhere in there, it's so easy at age 17, 18, 19, 20, for rebellion or breaking away or seeking your own independence to be built into it vis-a-vis your family.
Yeah,
how can you rule it out?
Right, yeah, that's right. But the problem is being able to see that, because very often that kind of motivation is hidden, isn't it? It's like the young women we see who are pregnant and they're bright, and we wonder, how did that ever happen? And sometimes it's clear that it is an act of rebellion. It's an act of defiance. It's a way of saying I'm important and people won't look at me and so on. And it's hard for many people to understand that, but it actually does happen.
Other times you see, we've seen, and this is, I think, perhaps more true of younger women than men, just a sense of emptiness and loneliness and a very weak sense of self-esteem and an attempt to kind of unify themselves with a man, throw themselves into a relationship, just kind of glom onto somebody thinking that kind of closeness is going to wash away all the problems, all the difficulties they face in dating and choosing among men, and in a sense escaping a lot of the complexity of being a late teenager or a young adult. There is a sense of safety and security and stability in a kind of living together with a man, especially if it's a pretty decent relationship. Yet there's a lot missed, and what I'm never sure of is, can one be at that age sure that they're not avoiding some other very difficult, very unpleasant, and very challenging tasks?
And necessary
How can you know?
Yeah.
Possibly very necessary.
Maybe if they're going to make a good marriage someday, they really ought to be attending to those things and trying to work them out. Norm, there is always a counterpoint. The counterpoint here, from my viewpoint, is the need for a developmental sense of morality. In other words, we cannot expect young people to have everything together in their life, to be perfect in every way. And nor can we expect that, especially in the area of sexuality and of relationships.
That's especially
We've been off in the Judeo-Christian tradition in not recognizing that sexual morality partakes of the general principles of morality, that God calls us to take a step forward, that He talks to us as we are, and that there is a developmental process in that, and people very often have to work through their own problems. They have to learn things for themselves. There's a traditional wisdom, but we can't always expect people to appropriate it at a young age. Now, a lot of people think differently about sexual matters than they do about any other question. Now, the stakes are high, especially if you think of pregnancy, and especially when you think of someone just being emotionally destroyed by a breakup. The stakes are high. You can't get away from that. But there's still the need to respect development and experimentation.
Erik Erikson, very famous psychoanalyst, has a phrase, psychosocial moratorium, which I think speaks to the issue you're raising a little bit. He talks about adolescence and young adulthood as a time in which you can freely experiment, and here you'd have to put experiment in quotes, with important matters without having to make a definitive choice. And that's with respect to career, to work, to love, to marriage, to parenthood, that a lot of the dating, the group membership, the friendships that evolve, the little movements toward intimacy and toward romantic love, all of those things can occur as a developmental stage or a developmental progression, and that one doesn't have to make the kind of commitment, assume the kind of responsibility that an intimate, romantic marriage, love relationship entail.
In general,
and if you can't, in a sense, then if you can't, you don't need to, so don't. Wait. But that doesn't mean you have to stop living.
In general, the college students we deal with are given a great luxury, aren't they? They have a period of time in their lives when they can check out, try things, and grow and develop. And that is one of the great gifts, I think, of the whole college years. Norm, I'm glad that you directed me in the beginning to the moral, ethical side of this whole question, because I think that we have to pull out the traditional wisdom here that we've learned over the centuries, and that is that sex is not just to be toyed with, and that relationships need to be treasured. The clear statement of our Judeo-Christian tradition is that full sexual expression should be saved for marriage. The more I deal with people, the more I see that there's a great wisdom involved in that. Now, when it comes down to actually dealing with young people, it becomes important to force them to check out their motivations, their deeper anxieties, what living together might be all about, so that they can think critically about it and not just get carried away by the emotion of the moment or just the convenience. And then I think that the wisdom of the Judeo-Christian tradition will be more real to them.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Dr. Norman Gadan, director of the Counseling Center of the University of Toledo. The topic of this week's Reflections was the morality of living together. Comments or questions on this show or suggestions for future topics should be sent to Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Campaign of the Diocese of Toledo.